Hello guys, in this video I'm going to be building this scene of the Millennium Falcon being chased through an asteroid belt by some TIE fighters from Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. And I'm going to use a combination of a model kit, some handmade asteroids and some 3D printed TIE fighters. So let's start with the model kit. This is the Millennium Falcon from Bandai, and you can see specifically it's the Empire Strikes Back version. If we look inside the box we can see the fantastic detail there on the bottom and the top of the Falcon itself, and then perhaps a dozen or so extra pieces to go on there, all fantastically detailed as you would expect if you built Bandai kits before. We have a set of stickers here, the various markings on the Falcon. This kit doesn't include water slide decals as well. The bigger kits do, but this one doesn't. And we can see that the instructions are printed on the inside of the box there, and it's only 8 steps. So here's a better look at the top of the Falcon. You can see the beautiful moulding there. Considering how small this is and it will basically fit in the palm of my hand, they've done a fantastic job of getting all that detail on there. This is a very simple kit with a small number of parts and no glue is required, it's all snapped together. So this build will be in virtually real time. So guys, there's not really much for me to say as you see me put the parts on here, other than they do snap together very nicely. The tolerances are perfect. They're not difficult to put together, but they are difficult to take apart again. So I didn't use any glue for this. I also decided to keep the top and the bottom of the Falcon separate, and the main reason I did that is because I would want to drill a hole into the bottom of the Falcon to add the stand at a later date. And the other reason I wanted to keep the top and bottom separate is so that I wouldn't need to add the hyperdrive lights just yet, and that way I could paint those separately. Well, there you go guys, that is the built Falcon, and as I say, that was basically a real-time build. It probably takes more time to cut the pieces off the sprue and do the minimal amount of sanding that there is, than it takes to put the kit together. I airbrushed the Falcon in a slightly off-white colour. Now the Falcon has a surprising number of markings, and the kit does provide stickers for that, and they are actually quite accurate to the film model. However, they don't provide a guide as to where these stickers need to go. So I tried putting a couple of them on and they looked okay. They would have probably looked okay under a matte varnish. But then I figured it probably would be quicker if I just got some acrylic paints and painted on the markings myself, and that's exactly what I did. I did consider doing a full pin wash on the Falcon, but after experimenting on a few of the deeper recessed areas, I didn't think it would look quite right to go over the entire thing with a pin wash. So I kept this pin wash, which is made from black oil paint, to just some of the deeper areas around the engine, some of that pipe work there that's exposed. And I think the result looks pretty good. Finally, I airbrushed on that famous exhaust soot onto those engines and added some transparent blue to the hyperdrive lights. Like a lot of people, and I think a lot of modelers in particular, I do like to keep scraps and offcuts of foam and styrene and things like that, thinking they'll one day come in handy. And this is one of those days. I wanted my asteroids to be nice and light for the material I was using to hold them up, so I didn't want to make them out of a big clump of plaster or even out of pure sculptamold, because that would be heavy itself. So I took some of these offcuts of foam, just cut them into a few sort of jagged shapes. These are not going to provide the edges of the asteroids, but they will just provide the lightweight internals. And I just PVA'd them in a sort of asteroidy kind of shape. Once that PVA glue was set, then I turned to my sculptamold and I put a nice light mixture of a sculptamold around the outside there to give it that classic asteroid kind of shape. I did this in 2 passes because, of course, if you cover the entire thing in sculptamold, then you have a problem of how do you put it down without getting a flat edge. So I covered one half, waited till the next day till it had dried, and then covered the other half. Here you can see the final result of that. I think these look pretty good. They're very lightweight. It's exactly what I was looking for. And a couple of smaller ones. And with this wooden base that I found, we can start to see how this is going to take shape. So we're going to have the Falcon coming out of this asteroid belt, and various TIE fighters chasing it, or trying to chase it, and perhaps not being so successful in dodging those asteroids. For the stands for the asteroids and for the Falcon, I used a 0.5mm drill, and then this wire which I found in a hobby shop a long time ago. Again, it's something I had lying around and I thought, let's have a bit of a spring clean, let's try and use some of these materials I've bought. It's quite easy to bend this wire into the required shape by hand, but it's strong enough that it won't get bent by those nice lightweight asteroids. Because the wire is thin though, I did make sure that the hole went quite a long way into the asteroid, and I put the wire quite a long way in there, as you can see. Of course, the advantage of this is once I get the asteroids attached to the base, I can still give them a bit of a twist or a tilt or something if I'm not quite happy with their positioning. And there we go, that big one there is actually suspended slightly above the base. We can start to see how that's going to look. Of course, because it's a space scene, I need to think about this in 3 dimensions, not just viewing it from the front. Sculptamold does have a plaster content, and so it's fairly absorbent. I didn't want to use model paints on it for that reason, because they're expensive. So I used some cheap black acrylic artist paint, thinned with a small amount of water, basically slapped it on. Effectively, this is acting as something of a primer layer, and then did the same thing for the base as well. I haven't shown the airbrushing, but I took a variety of greys and browns, and I gave multiple coats, thin coats, partial coats of paint to each of the asteroids, and that was to try to get an uneven finish and get a non-uniform colour. For example, I might spray it in a grey and then halfway through spraying put a couple of drops of flat earth in there, then maybe a drop of black, and just mix it up basically. Spray a few highlights in a lighter colour. And what I'm doing here, once that paint is dry, is taking a dark black oil paint, thinned with enamel thinners, and I'm basically doing a pin wash on these asteroids. So I'm putting it into the recess areas of the asteroids to try to create some fake shadows. And of course, shadows in space tend to be quite intense, quite dark, so I'm really slapping this paint on here. The effect does get toned down after it's dried, and so I did need to add it again for a couple of these. I just included this clip here to show you that not all my asteroids are the same tone. This one's got much more of a brown hue. Finally, for the asteroids, I gave them a very light dry brush of a lighter colour, so generally speaking a lighter grey colour. I applied that only over the most prominent of the raised areas. Okay, I'm moving on to the TIE fighters, and this was the exciting bit for me. I was very lucky to have Santa buy me a Anycubic Photon Mono 3D printer in the recent Black Friday sales. And one of the first things I printed was TIE fighters for this mini diorama. So I headed over to Thingiverse and I found myself a TIE fighter model. There's quite a few different ones on there. This was a free download, I'll put a link to it in the description. And I loaded it into the slicer program that comes with the Anycubic printer. You can see here there's some lovely detail on this, but the first thing I had to do was work out how large to make the TIE fighter. And to work that out, I had to work out what scale the Falcon was. Rather unhelpfully, Bandai don't tell us this on the box, and it's a slightly different size to the Revel one, so I can't use that. So, looking up online, the real Millennium Falcon is just under 35 meters in length. My model Falcon is 100 millimeters, so if we divide 34,750 millimeters by 100 millimeters, that gives us a scale of approximately 350 to 1 for the Millennium Falcon. Now that I know the scale of the Falcon, I can scale my TIE fighter to be a 1 to 350 scale version of the real TIE fighter. So we take the dimensions of the real TIE fighter, we divide them by the scale, so 347. And that gives us a length and a width of approximately 20 millimeters by approximately 25 millimeters height. And the slicing software which comes with the printer makes it really easy to do this scaling. And in fact, you only have to enter the scale for one of the sides, and you can lock it so that the entire thing scales in relation to that, so that's quite handy. With that in place, I decided I obviously wanted more than one TIE fighter. So the grey grid here on the screen represents the build plate for the 3D printer. Now before I could do anything else, I needed to add some supports to the fighter so that when it was printed it wouldn't collapse. You can see those here in brown. They're snipped off after printing. and I cloned the TIE fighter so that I would print 6 of them. You can see here each one has slightly different supports. That's entirely because I was playing around. I fully expected some of these to fail, but because it was my first print, I wanted to see what kind of supports worked the best. Obviously, the fewer supports, the less cleanup you have, but also the higher risk you have of the print failing. Talking of prints failing, this is my first result. And as you can see, the wings are see-through. There's a very simple reason for that. I actually chose a very detailed TIE fighter model, and because I scaled it down, the wings basically became too thin to print at that low scale. So a great amount of detail on that model. It would have printed fine if it was larger, but I had to choose a lower resolution TIE fighter model to actually print. And when I did that, here is my next attempt, and I think that is pretty nice. It's still got a great amount of detail, especially in the cockpit there. You see on the top, in front. You can see I printed this one at an angle just to see if it would print any differently. I'm very pleased with the results of that. And of course it looks even better when it's been given a coat of black paint and then some grey over the top. There are a few ridges there you can see in those side panels. That's the layers of the printing, that's not detail. But it kind of looks like it might be detail, so I'm going to leave it in there. I'm not super unhappy with that, but I will use that as a learning experience next time. Of course the TIE fighters are quite hard to paint because they have these black panels. I didn't fancy masking all of this, so I painted the whole thing in grey, and then as best I could I brush painted the black, trying to stay within the lines. Now for some reason, which I can only put down to my own incompetence, I forgot to film much of me making the base. But suffice to say, I took a small wooden base, drilled some holes in it, and poked that wire that I showed you earlier through it. And then in order to keep the wire in place underneath the base, I just bent it over and twisted it around a few times. I didn't glue it in place because I figured the ability to move the object slightly might be advantageous later on. I didn't want too many wires holding up things, especially with the TIE fighters because they're quite small. So for a couple of the outside TIE fighters, I just glued the very edge of their wings onto the edge of the asteroid. So it looks like they're flying past it, but hopefully at this scale it does look like it's very close but not quite touching. So hopefully that looks okay. Right, with that done, it was time to put everything together. So let's have a look at the final result. There we go guys, that was my scene from The Empire Strikes Back, featuring the Millennium Falcon being chased by some TIE fighters. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know that science fiction kits are not the most popular on my channel, but I still do enjoy building them. This in particular was a nice break away from the longer, more involved kits, and in particular I enjoyed the mixed media here, so the traditional model kit, the hand making of the asteroids, and the 3D printing for the TIE fighters. I thought that worked quite well, and I think that also reflects how I'm planning to use my 3D printer in the future. Yes, you can get some files online with some very detailed model files where you could almost build complete kits, certainly in smaller scales, with a 3D printer. But I think at first, especially, the way I imagine myself using this 3D printer is to print sort of accessories and so on, just sort of unique items to make my models stand out a bit, to make them a bit different. This could be something as simple as some stowage, for example, that just looks a bit different to the stowage you can get in the standard Tamiya or Bronco stowage accessory packs and so on. It's definitely a learning curve using the 3D printer, and I'm only very much at the beginning of that curve. So I will report back to you in my future videos on not just the items I've printed, but some of the lessons I've learnt on the way. Personally, I was really surprised by how the price of these printers has fallen. This is only a 2K printer that I've got. There are 4K and even 6K printers out there now. But to be honest, this 2K printer does it for me. One of the advantages of the higher resolution printers is the bigger build plate, but I'm quite happy with this smaller one for now at least. So guys, all that remains is for me to say thank you very much to you for watching this video, and a special thanks to my Patreon supporters. You can see their names on the screen now. These guys provide constant support to the channel, and I really appreciate it. Just recently on our Patreon page we were discussing a variety of kits which I'm going to be building in a new series which is coming up in 2022. I'll tell you more about that later. So until next time guys, stay safe, have a happy new year, and have fun modelling.